Ladies and gentlemen, gather around for a unique look into the world of custom motorcycling. We've gathered some of the industry's top builders and fabricators on this stage to show you their skills live and in person. Watch as they chop, grind, and weld their creations into existence right before your very eyes. Feel free to ask questions at any time directly to your host, Pat Jansen. The doors to the shop are open, so pull up a stool, kick back, and welcome to the Grease and Gears Garage.
All right, folks, Grease and Gears Garage. What's Grease and Gears Garage? Well, we're a bunch of greasy mechanics. That's why we put it in the name. We build custom motorcycles. There's a crew of us that travel around the country with a bunch of tools. We got Mark and what's his name? Chris. Now, Chris is the editor, owner, founder of Cycle Source magazine. He and Mark Persichetti have a shop, Flat Broke Chops and Rods in Pittsburgh. I got a shop, Sin Central Garage, outside of Des Moines, Iowa. But we come together for Grease and Gears Garage, and we invite people, custom builders, performance guys, people that are helping the custom world kind of thrive on the stage to share with folks what it's like, a slice of life out of a shop. Most people don't get to hang out in a shop very often. Most people are a little intimidated by the tools and the processes of customizing things. So what we want to do is we want to invite you in. This is now, you're in a garage now. You can close your eyes if you have to imagine it. You're in a garage, and if you have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. You can come up here. If there's something that you want to see closer, you're more than welcome to get up. We've got 3 cameras. You'll see stuff on the screens out at the side. We also Facebook Live this. You can go to JMP Cycles, our great partner, world's largest distributor of aftermarket motorcycle parts. Go to their social media. You can see this. You can go to motorcycleshows.com, Cycle Source magazine. You can go to our YouTube channel, Grease and Gears Garage, because everything we've done for all throughout this series, from Long Beach to here, is all archived there, and you can go see how to narrow gas tanks, build Springer front ends, and that kind of stuff. So if you just participate with us, just hang out with us for a little bit, and you're going to learn something, and hopefully we'll have a little fun. We got Lyndon Abell with us here today with Harley-Davidson, All-American Harley-Davidson, and you were going to go over performance stuff, things that go suck, bang, and blow, correct?
You got it.
All right. Well, Lyndon, take it away, and your trusty assistant is on a water hunt, so I will.
No, she's
I
right
thought
there.
you were doing this. You don't have to, but you're better looking than both of us. You're much easier on the eyes.
I think she can do it from down there.
Oh,
right?
all right. Well, now she just refuses to be up here. That's cool. So, Lyndon.
Okay, so my name's Lyndon Abell. I run All-American Harley-Davidson, which is about 35 miles south of here. And I am not a professional presenter, unlike my good friend Pat up here. But I am passionate about Harley-Davidsons and motorcycles. And, it's been sort of a lifelong love of mine. And so I do some seminars now and then. And this is essentially one of them, slightly modified. Where a lot of people are interested in making their bike go faster. I think that's just sort of something that's in our blood, right? Oh, it's fast, but can it be faster? Well,
we said yesterday, man wanted to go faster, so we went from walking to running, and then when the running wasn't good enough, we mounted something, and ever since then we've tried to get whatever we're riding to go faster.
Right, exactly.
Whether it be beast or machine.
So, but there's a lot of confusion out there, sometimes a lack of understanding of what horsepower is and what torque is and what that means. And so we're going to start off and just talk a little bit about what a four-stroke motor is, and so we can sort of get on the same page, how it works, and then we're going to talk about how you make more performance. Where's my overview slide? Is that next? Yeah, so components of a four-cycle motor, how it works, meaning of torque and horsepower. You guys may all know this, but I've found that there is a lot of confusion about that, so we're going to address it. And then, the meat of it, how to create more power. The Milwaukee 8 motor is Harley-Davidson's new motor that they came out with last year, and there are some specific things about that. So we're going to talk about that briefly. If you want more details, stick around and talk to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I don't want to take up too much time with that. And then we're going to talk about tuning. Carburetors are long gone for a lot of folks, but I'm happy to talk about them. But EFI is really the way of the world these days, and so we're going to talk specifically about how EFI is tuned and different ways to tune it, and what I would recommend. A quick dynamometer 101. I don't know if you guys have all seen a dyno sheet, but some people look at them and go, you know, what do those crazy lines mean? So we'll just sort of answer that, and then go over a couple of performance packages that Harley-Davidson does and try to demystify some of that. Everybody heard of like a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, right? But it's confusing because it means different things to different people on different motors.
Yeah, because in the legal system, it's got a completely different set of fenders.
Oh, you don't want to.
But we won't go there.
But you know, things used to be pretty simple with what a stage 1 was, and then when Harley moved from the Evo to the twin cam motor, that stuff sort of changed, and then you know it continued to change. And they had a stage 1 that was actually a change in displacement and compression, and people were like, "What the heck does this all mean?" So they have tried to simplify this, but I'll go through some of that, and then again, if there's more questions, I don't, it's tricky balance getting into enough detail but not wearing everybody out. So if you need more detail, raise your hand, ask a question, or stick around afterwards. Fair enough?
This is really handy because if you happen to fall asleep any place in the midst of the presentation, when you wake up, you'll know exactly where we're at. That's handy. I like that. I could use that when my wife's arguing with me.
You got a laser pointer, Pat?
I don't, but I got a finger.
So so normally I have a motor in front of me and I can point to some of these pieces. Hey, let's use this motor right here.
Here's a motor right here.
So just so we're sort of on the same page, we're going to go through what the components are. Some people point at these and refer to them as heads. That's a rocker box. This is just a box that covers up the rocker assembly, and we'll get to what that is in a moment. This is the cylinder head from here to here. This is the piston, the cylinder from here to here. The piston goes up and down inside that, which you can see in the picture of that cutaway motor. That motor is actually at our dealership, so if you want to make a trip down there, it is super cool. And then, can I just point at this?
Yeah, you can point.
It gets hard to see when you're over here. And this is the connecting rod. Okay, that's the wrist pin that connects the connecting rod to the piston. And then this is the flywheel assembly down here, this guy. And these are the cases right there. So the very bottom of the motor, which you can see right here. These are the push rod tubes. The push rods go up and down inside there, and they are pushed up and down by the cam lobes. There's a camshaft. That's the cam lobe, right? So that's pushing on a lifter, which is pushing that push rod, which tips a rocker arm, which opens the valve. It's like a very Rube Goldberg contraption, but it works surprisingly well.
And surprisingly simple, kind of, when you wrap your head around.
I mean, just like a Rube Goldberg simple, like the ball hits the thing and it chases the mouse, and the mouse hits the scale, and the scale knocks the parakeet off. And that
makes sense once you see it.
Right. Okay, and we're actually going to see it. So we covered pistons. The piston rings are just the what keep the piston sliding up and down in the cylinder appropriately. So we've covered that. So next slide. Okay, so here's how it works, right? It's a 4-stroke motor, sometimes called a 4-cycle motor, and there are 4 strokes or 4 cycles. And there's intake, right? And that's when the piston is coming down. So you see that on the left, and that blue represents the air and fuel coming into the motor. And then there is compression, otherwise known as squeeze, right? The piston comes up and squeezes that air and fuel mixture into a much smaller space, which makes it very volatile, right? So there's a lot of energy in there. Molecules are bouncing around pretty hard. And then the spark plug fires, right? Kablamo. That's power, otherwise known as bang. And that pushes the piston down, which is the only one of those 4 strokes where there's power being created. The others are just along for the ride, right? And then the exhaust valve opens, the piston comes back up and blows out the exhaust gases. So that's the exhaust stroke, right? So we got suck, squeeze, bang, blow, or intake, compression, power, exhaust. All right? Now I think we have a video, right? Next. All right, so that's that cutaway motor actually running.
No way.
Look at the left side, right? There's the intake.
Pretty cool.
Compression, bang, power,
I've seen one of those, did you?
exhaust.
Pretty cool.
I mean, can I get a hand for the guy that built that cutaway motor? That's awesome,
amazing.
right?
I mean, I've never seen
it's
that.
It's the coolest
thing. I just
thing.
went and asked Mark if he'd ever seen one of those.
The motor company wishes they had one of those. I sent them videos to make them jealous. You want to see that again?
Yeah, I do want to see that again. That's pretty.
Hey, TJ, can you run that again?
Oh, you hit go backwards and then you can go forwards, can't you?
Yeah, go back and then.
There you go.
Nice. All right, the other thing that, just while we're looking at it, this is really what's turning things, right? And it turns this chain, which is what turns that clutch around. When the clutch is pushed together, that spins the main shaft, which turns the transmission and ultimately turns the pulley that turns the rear wheel. A little more of that Rube Goldberg stuff, right?
There you go.
You're loving this, aren't you,
Pat? I'm loving it. I like that cutaway. I want one now.
You can have one, but they're really expensive.
They're really, yeah. I know you can have anything for a price.
Cutaway Creations is the company that made that, and Mike McGee runs that company. Really cool guy. Okay, so what is torque and what is horsepower? Torque is a twisting force, right? So it's a force, and it's expressed in pounds-feet, right, or foot-pounds, which you've probably heard. And in its simplest terms, if you take a ruler that's 1 foot long, and you place a 1 pound weight on the end of it, that's 1 foot-pound of torque, or 1 pounds feet, depending on whether you're English or American. So it's that twisting force is what's represented when we talk about power. That's really what we're talking about, is the torque that's turning the motor. And sometimes there's a lot of confusion about this. People will say, well, I really want more torque. I'm more interested in torque than horsepower. And I know what they mean. What they mean is they want low-end grunt as opposed to high-end speed. But really, they're both together, because horsepower is simply a mechanical calculation. So if you take torque and multiply it times the RPMs at which the motor is spinning and divide that number by 5,252, that's horsepower. So
I was told there would be no math.
I'm not going to quiz you, Pat.
Thanks, because
I'm going to get you the T-shirt. So it's really all about torque, right? It's not horsepower, which is typically represented as a max horsepower number. So, my motor produces 100 horsepower. Okay, that's cool. But, where? So if you're at a Harley Davidson and you're producing 100 horsepower, that's a pretty good number. But if it's producing that number at 6,000 RPMs and you've never taken your motor past 4,000, I would argue that that's an irrelevant number. So what's really relevant is how much torque it's creating in the places where you want it to be creating torque, right? So if you roll down the highway at about 3,000 RPMs, and what's really important to you is that you have a lot of grunt when you give it the gas, and you don't want to have to downshift, then you want to have a good solid amount of torque between 3,000 and 4,000 RPMs. If you're doing that at 2,000 RPMs, I would suggest that you change your riding style a little bit if you want more power. But the point is, I like to talk to people about where you're going to ride, right? What's your riding style? What are you trying to do? There's not a one-size-fits-all answer for most things in life, and this is one of them. So thinking about how you ride, what you do with your motorcycle, how long you want it to last, whether you're racing it or street riding it, all of that stuff goes into a determination of how we want to create power for you. Okay, so if somebody came to me and said, I used to get this question a lot, I just want my bike to make 100 horsepower, and I'd say, okay, cool, I can do that pretty easily. I can probably just do it with a cam change, but you're going to hate the motor, right? It's going to make a lot less power at 3,000 RPMs. You're going to hit your horsepower number at 6,000 RPMs. Well, that sucks. I want to do that. Okay, so that's why we want to have a conversation about where you ride. It's all about torque. Torque, where you ride.
That's a really important thing. 'Cause I've come kind of out of the Evo world. You know, I'm still a huge fan of the Evo drivetrain, and I still, this is my 2 cents. I think there was a lot left in that motor, rather than going to the twin cam. But at my shop, guys would come in and say, I want a 100 horsepower motor, so I need to. So
you used to hear that all the time.
And I would say, I can make 100 horsepower out of that 80-inch Evo. That's not a problem.
But
they didn't like it.
You're not going to like it.
But they paid for it, and then they'd bring it back, and we'd have to fix it.
Well, see, unlike
you, used to hear that all the time.
I would have that conversation ahead of time rather than disappoint my customer.
The customer's always right.
especially when you help them learn.
Yeah.
So, torque provides leverage, and that's just a little quote from Archimedes for those of you who appreciate that sort of thing. Okay, next slide, right? So this is a quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a little slide that Harley put together for the Milwaukee 8. They realized that they didn't do a great job with twin cam, and they created a lot of confusion over the years of what is a stage 1, what is a stage 2. So for the Milwaukee 8, they've attempted to simplify it and say stage 1 is intake and exhaust, right? It's just moving more air. Same cam, same displacement, same compression. So it's exhaust, intake, and tuning, right? So, well, no, we'll talk about that later. So stage 2, yeah.
Heather?
Okay,
Mark,
so his question was, what's the percentage of increase in airflow in the Milwaukee 8 motor versus the twin cam? And the answer is I don't know, but there is a substantial potential for increase with those heads. But there's a variety of different things that can control that airflow, and it's not just the valves, right? So if the valves are, out of the motor, right, so you've got a flow bench testing the flow, it'll outflow the twin cam motor, but not substantially. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's probably not huge. But the difference is, right, the door doesn't just disappear, right? It's how far the door is opened, right, in the case of the valve, how far it's opened, how quickly it's opened, how long it stays open, and when it opens also. That all contribute to how much airflow there is. And then, of course, there's other bottlenecks or potentials for bottleneck in the exhaust, in the throttle body, and in the air cleaner. Okay, so I know I didn't really answer your question, but I hope are we good? Two valves have the capacity to flow more than one, but I'll talk a little bit about the Milwaukee 8 motor later. It wasn't just about airflow. That's Heather, by the way.
If you ask questions, pretty girls come and sit next to you. It's just
right. Let this be a lesson to you.
That's right.
So it's not just about that. They were also trying to address heat, I think valve train life, and a variety of other things. Some of this is speculation on my part, but it's reasonably educated speculation. Okay, so what they've done for Milwaukee 8 is say that stage 1 is intake, exhaust, and tuning. Stage 2 is that plus adding a camshaft. Stage 3 is that, maybe not the same camshaft, but also an increase in displacement. So air, intake, exhaust, tuning, cam, and in the case of the Milwaukee 8, taking the motor from 107 cubic inches up to 114 cubic inches. And then stage 4 is all of that, plus performance heads and a throttle body that has a much larger throttle body, and a couple of other things to take advantage of that increase in power, like a more aggressive clutch that has capacity for better hookup. Okay, so that's I think enough of that for now. Next. I told you I wasn't a professional, so this helps me stay on track. Okay, so
this looks pretty professional to me. I'm a little.
Hey, you can thank Jessica for that.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, so there's 3 ways to create more power. There's 2 ways to create more power everywhere, right? So when people say you can get this substantial increase in power from just changing your cam, that's generally not accurate. What you're doing is you're increasing the peak horsepower, right? But what you're really doing is moving where the motor is making its most efficient torque generally higher in the RPM range. And because it's higher in the RPM range, remember, horsepower is a calculation of torque times RPM divided by a constant number, so therefore the horsepower number is going to be higher. But the way to create more power everywhere is displacement and compression. Anybody ever heard the phrase, there's no replacement for displacement?
Yes.
Never heard that before?
Never heard that before? Really? Oh, he's heard it. Yeah, that guy's.
I'm leaving. I'm done.
All right, well, me too.
Okay, so the reason that everybody's heard that statement is because it's true. If you can get away with increasing the size of the motor, you should probably do that. And obviously that comes down to whether you can do that, in a price point that your wallet can afford. For instance, the Evo motor, you could increase the size of the displacement, but there's a lot of work involved. Whereas bumping up a twin cam, which originally started at 88, bumping that up to 95 was very easy, and bumping up the displacement of the Milwaukee 8 is very easy. Okay, compression is generally expressed as a ratio, but there's a little confusion in that. You remember that? Where'd Jessica go?
She's back there now.
Hey, go back to the suck, squeeze, bang, blow slide.
Right.
One more.
And then one more, yeah. There.
Okay. So you see in the first slide, top left, okay, there's let's just call that 50 cubic inches in there so we can use round numbers, right, of swept area. So there's 50 cubic inches of volume in that cylinder, right? Okay, look at the second slide where it's squeezed up into the combustion chamber. So let's just say that's squeezed into a combustion chamber that has 5 cubic inches, right? So that would be a 10-to-1 compression ratio, right? It's 1/10 the size of the overall swept volume. So when people talk about 10-to-1 compression, that's what they're talking about. And an increase in compression increases the volatility of that fuel and air mixture, and those molecules are bouncing around even harder and faster, and when you light the fuse with the spark plug, you get a bigger bang. Okay? All right, so go forward like 4 slides.
It's putting waffles on top of your Mexican food late night. This guy gets that totally.
That's what we keep him around for.
That's why I'm here.
Okay, so to create more power everywhere, you want to increase the displacement or increase the compression. Displacement is your first choice, but if you simply increase the size of the motor, the displacement, right, and you don't change the size of the combustion chamber, guess what else happens? An increase in compression. Thank you.
Can you also effectively do that with a piston change?
Yes. You can also do that by leaving the size of the motor the same and making the combustion chamber smaller. So there's really 2 ways to do that. Change the head or change the piston. So you can use a head that has a different shaped combustion chamber that has a smaller combustion chamber. And, I think Evo started out with like a 76 cc volume in their combustion chamber, and you typically see performance heads that were 72. So that was just to increase the compression. And then also, as Pat suggested, there's pistons, right? So I don't know. We got a camera that can do a close-up?
Yeah, right here. Right here. I stand in front of it, and Egg yells at me. I'm sorry, Egg.
Hey, give me
Egg,
a
I'm real
shot
sorry.
Can we see this?
Stop laughing at me.
Is he sleeping, or are we seeing it?
Oh, they're seeing it on the screens out here.
How do I see that? Can they see it?
They can see it.
Okay, so you see this one is
You
flat?
see it this way.
Well, I know, but I thought I was going to be able to see it down there.
That's
See, this one is flat all the way across, and this one has a little bump up there. So that's exactly what that's for, is to reduce the size of the combustion chamber and increase the compression. Combined with an increase in displacement on a Milwaukee 8 motor, this takes it from 10-to-1 to 11-to-1. All right. So those things will make power everywhere. Displacement is kind of sort of free except for the wallet part. Compression does add a little more stress to your motor. Those bigger explosions and more pressure when it comes up stresses the motor a little bit more. Not a big deal, though. We're trying to have a good time. That's why we're doing this stuff, right?
That's right.
I mean, you don't want to blow your motor up, but there is a certain sense of pride of going, yeah, man, I'll blow it up, too.
And I tell you,
You've never done that, have you?
It's an amazing feeling. I mean, to have that moment when it does it and grenades on you, you're like, that's expensive. Ooh, that was fun. Whatever you were doing was a lot of fun.
Right. Okay, so another way to create power is simply, putting more air through it, right? So the first step in that, we talked about what these different places are where you can put more air into the motor, but it starts at the intake. So I brought a stock. You should hold this up because I don't know what the camera.
Oh yeah, here I can hold it up. Egg and I are tight. We do this all the time. He's usually just shooting my back.
This is the stock filter on a Milwaukee 8 motor, And this is the stock air box. So it's got a pretty good opening through here, right? Is that showing? I'm going to just take it on faith. But if you look at the rest of this box, you see how sealed up it is, right? And then this has relatively small surface area. Now, if you relocate that to the trash can and you replace that filter with this, and look at the difference in surface area. So it just breathes more. Now, if there's no other change anyplace else, it's not going to move a lot more air because the stock one is pretty much sufficient for everything else that's in there. But let's say you had a larger throttle body, different cams that would open the valves farther and longer, a more free-flowing exhaust, and then you had that stock intake on there. That'd be, similar to showering with the raincoat, right?
Which isn't very effective.
Which is not effective. Thank you.
The point. We were losing this guy here. We got him back with that though.
Is he texting?
No, he wasn't. He was just kind of. I thought he was have a stroke.
That's a basic stage one. This is a heavy breather, which has a substantial amount of surface area around there. But pretty much anything that gets rid of the stock air box and opens things up is going to allow the motor to breathe a little better. Sometimes, however, you'll see some like really cool looking things and they're really small and you go, wait, that's actually not going to let it breathe more. It may look cool, and that's okay, right? Life's filled with compromises, but just know what you're getting. Okay, so, and honestly, a lot of people, maybe most people, do an air cleaner because they're trying to change the exhaust, which they're interested in doing because of sound reasons.
Or it's just for aesthetics.
And looks.
Yeah.
Right. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. If
I could change my looks, I would.
Some of those different air cleaners really look nice. Is this mine?
But yes, sir, that's yours. I was drinking out of it, but you can.
That's okay.
I wasn't.
Cooties.
I'm not over here.
Okay, what's the next slide? Exhaust, right? Okay. So this is probably the area where there's the most desire to change, and there's really three things to consider when you're considering exhaust. And I'm really speaking of Harley-Davidson, but I would say that a lot of this stuff transfers across different models. But it's looks, sound, and performance, right? So, sometimes somebody says, well, I just want the best performing exhaust system, and then you show them a 2-in-1 that looks kind of funny, and they go, ooh, I don't like the way that looks. Okay, so looks a little more important than performance. Nothing wrong with that. Just we need to know what's important to you and then what you like within those categories, and we can give you a great recommendation for exhaust. But I have so this is a stock header pipe. Since 09 on Harley's touring models, they've had catalytic converters in the touring header pipe. And you guys seeing that? So that's the catalytic converter. You think that's going to slow down the exhaust flow a little bit?
I'm feeling like even though it's a spirally thing, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, that does two things. It retains heat, and it slows down. It also makes the EPA happy, so just so we're clear.
And we're in Washington, D.C.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'm in your way. I mean, I got it.
So this is a header pipe that will actually accept the stock heat shields. And it has no cat in there. I don't know if we can see into that. Probably not. I shined a flashlight through here before. But if anybody wants to see it, just come on up and I'll let you take a peek in there. But so this is a replacement header. This combined with some free flow mufflers will make a dramatic change with your exhaust. Look very similar to stock. Reduce a little bit of heat if you are so inclined. So one of the things that I think creates a lot of confusion about exhaust is that, we tend to think of it a little bit like a garden hose, right? So you turn the faucet on, and how much water is going to come through that pipe? And, logic would tell us that if it's a bigger pipe, it's going to flow more stuff, right? So, the bigger the pipe, the better the performance. But stop and back up for a second and think about the suck, squeeze, bang, blow, right? So only one of those 4 cycles has exhaust coming out of it, right? So there's 25% of the time, there's exhaust coming out, right? A little puff of exhaust, and then there's 75% of the time when nothing's going on. So it's really more like a garden hose that you turn on for a millisecond and then shut it off for a few milliseconds and then turn it back on. But it's even more complicated than that, because what comes out of the exhaust port is super hot, right? So those gases behave in a different way than cold gases would behave. As soon as they leave the exhaust port, they start cooling off, and they get progressively cooler as they go out. And so they start to back up and do stuff like this. And if you have a really big open pipe, they just get out there and get confused and hang around and get in the way of other things coming out. One of the reasons that a 2-into-1 works effectively is it harnesses the power of this earlier puff. This is all super simple terms, so if you're really into the engineering of this, just try to recognize that I'm trying to give a basic explanation. But it harnesses the power of those puffs together, right, to help pull them all through. So does that kind of make sense? Seeing a few nods. Yes, sir.
Scavenging.
Scavenging. So yeah, I mean that's the effect that you're speaking of, and that's what I try to put in there. And you know, back pressure is probably a term that a lot of people have heard. If you have literally no back pressure, so that big open pipe, that's what back pressure is talking about, right? And those gases just get out and get in the way. If you create a little back pressure, you actually increase the torque at lower RPMs.
That was a classic problem back in the day with Harley guys with shovel heads and iron head sportsers and stuff, because, well, there weren't a lot of exhaust choices then, but they do drag pipes, you know, staggered dual drag pipes that were just wide open. And you take a bike that actually ran pretty good, you know, with its stock exhaust, and you could just kill the performance.
Yeah, so, and what people would say was, well, the guy at the racetrack is running 2-inch drag, so that obviously makes the most power.
And it made more noise, so they assumed it made more power.
Well, then that's mental horsepower. But it does make more power at 6,000 RPM. The problem is the torque is killed right where most people want it, right? Between 2,500 and 3,500, you have this big dip in the torque curve, and that doesn't make for a satisfying ride. Now, for some people, they went, I don't care. I like the way it sounds. Okay, that's cool. As long as we're being honest with ourselves, right? It's looks, sound, and performance. If sound's number one and you dig that sound, okay.
And we'll see you when you get here.
Yeah, see you later. Okay, let's move forward. And also in moving more air, we have throttle bodies and cylinder heads. So we talked about that a little bit. Here we go, Vanna. So here's a stock, show them the opening. So the stock Milwaukee 8 throttle body is actually pretty good sized, but I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but this is a 64 millimeter that comes with the Stage 4 and simply moves more air. In stock trim, that's really not going to make any difference. But once you're moving a lot more air with other things, right, increase in displacement, increase in cam timing, you don't want that bottleneck in there. It also comes with, because you got to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but when you add more air, you have to add the appropriate amount of fuel. A lot of times most of the time you can just do that with tuning, but in some cases you need to add more gas by having a higher capacity fuel injector. So that throttle body comes with these fancy fuel injectors. Let's go to cams next, because that's really part of the equation also. Okay, so cams are the personality of your motor. In simple terms, compression and displacement will move the torque curve up or down, right? So an increase in displacement will increase the torque curve pretty much everywhere. Cam timing will change where that peak is within the torque curve. See you guys later.
Sorry, we are as interesting as we possibly can.
It's Pat's fault.
It's my fault. Blame me. Tell the front office.
So
if that's not a baby, you're going to want to get that looked at, by the way. It could be a tumor, I'm just saying. Later you'll think he is anyway.
So as we discussed earlier, the important thing is to match the cam profile, the cam being the personality of your motor, with the personality that you want of your motor, right? If you're at the drag strip and you're trying to get maximum power, it's cool if you want your max torque to be at 6,000 RPMs, right? Because you're winding up to 6,000, dumping the clutch and holding on. But if you're a street rider, you probably want a less peaky motor. You want, when I say peaky, I mean a peaky motor is one that makes a lot of power at a very specific spot, but it's not making a lot of power in other places. If looked at on a dyno sheet, and we'll see one of those later, I like to say you want to see something that looks more like an umbrella and less like the Matterhorn. Okay? But cams are the personality of your motor, and back in the older days, I got this question a lot: what's the best cam for this motor? And there's no good answer for that question, because it's really, what's the best cam for this kind of riding, for this kind of motor that has these other components? A lot of people thought, well, I'll do this, like I built my stereo in the 70s. I'll get the receiver and then I'll get the turntable. But the cam is part of the equation. So the appropriate cam for this displacement, this compression, is going to be different than the best cam for that displacement and that compression. Okay?
Which is one of the things, and I've said this time and time again over this show series, that's one of the nice things that I really like about what the motor company's done.
Yeah.
And other aftermarket folks, is it used to be you had to come to a shop and even the dealers had to just try to figure it out.
Yep.
But now there's kits so that you at least that this stuff works together.
Yeah, and the advertising doesn't help. This cam pulls strong from 15, from idle to 6,000 RPMs.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to just.
It's not actually physically possible.
On every Evo, you just put an EV27 cam in it.
That was
a great cam. It was a great
nice cam,
mid-range cam, but it wasn't necessarily
the best cam for your application.
Absolutely.
So if you'd increased your compression and you were dealing with an FXR, a lighter chassis, and you were looking to make a lot more power, not a great choice. Just bolt that in and rejet the carburetor. That's a pretty good choice.
Yeah.
Okay, so next, cams are your personality. Okay, so performance and EFI modifications. That's a picture of the same thing there. So that laptop represents, one of the many slides that we look at when we're tuning Harley's stocky fuel injection module with a street performance tuner, or the, may it rest in peace, wonderful super tuner that Harley Davidson had for many years. It was really a great device. And so it's pretty complicated. We're looking at all these slides, all these different screens and tables. You can adjust it so much that the thing really doesn't want to run at all if you do it wrong. So it's not something that you want to just take a crack at. You need some proper training. But unlike a carburetor,
Oh, we got a question, Heather. This helps the folks on Facebook Live watching to be able to wait for that.
If you change the intake and you change the exhaust, do you have to put a tuner on it? And if you put the tuner on it, can you program it yourself with your laptop in your garage, or do you have to take it someplace to have it dyno tuned?
Okay, did everybody hear that? So the answer is, if you change the intake and the exhaust, absolutely you should tune it. These things come from the factory on the ragged edge of lean. And increasing the airflow without changing the fuel flow is going to make your motor run A, too lean, B, too hot, and will ultimately lead to damage. And, if you've got a buddy who said, I did that and it was fine, it's not fine.
Basically, running lean there, if you'll speak to that, is just not enough fuel.
Right.
And the reason that happens is because of EPA. They're trying to reduce the emissions, and so you're just getting and every OEM has to do this. They starve the motor.
Also.
In cars, they starve the motor for fuel. You're running on as little bit of fuel as you can possibly run on, and eventually that's just, it'll work. You don't have to You can ride a stock bike forever, but you don't want to get it any leaner than what it came from the factory.
Right. So in simple terms, pretty optimum is 14 parts of air for 1 part of fuel, and you'll typically see them running about 14 and a half. To be fair, the leaner you get it, you generally get more efficiency. You can create more power up to a point, and you certainly get better fuel mileage. But it also runs hotter, and again, up to a point. They've got it up to that point from the factory. You don't want to add more air without adding more fuel, and most people would actually like to add more fuel without adding more air, just to make it run a little bit smoother and a little bit cooler.
Can you plug a laptop in and do the tune yourself?
Okay, so that depends on the tuning device. There are some tuning devices out there that today that actually work pretty well. I certainly wouldn't have recommended the Super Tuner for a home brew, but there's a Power Visions, which is, if you're comfortable with that kind of stuff, and Vance & Hines FP3, which isn't bad, and we'll talk about those in just a second. But the answer is it depends. It's like, when I get asked, can I put this on myself? And I go, I don't know. My mom couldn't. I can.
Now, is your question, can you
depends.
tune the Harley tuner? Is that
specifically
the Harley tuner? That's okay.
So Harley's tuner, their new street performance tuner, you could do that because they come set up with maps for very specific combinations. If you have the cables, which are sold, you could do that. It's not expensive to have a dealer do it, though, so I'm not sure how much upside there is. The devices that are made for consumers are a little easier to, plug and play, but they're typically piggyback devices, and I'll talk about that here next. Okay, so there's essentially three ways to tune. In the simplest terms, there's basically three different ways to tune your Harley-Davidson EFI system. One is a piggyback system, so that's another module, right? So, and there's a million of these things out there, and some of them are super, super simple, and all they do is try to add or subtract a little bit of fuel, and there are some which are really very robust and do an awful lot of stuff. Probably the best example of that would be the Power Commander. The problem with the piggyback device is it's another item to fail, and it's kind of tricking the ECM. So the ECM is really the brain box of the whole motorcycle, and it's doing inputs, and it's getting information back from its roughly 6 sensors, depending on your bike, that don't always add up. And so sometimes that can create some problems. And then, where I often see the biggest problem, besides the piggyback unit itself, is at the connection, which can sometimes be problematic. The other issue with them is finding some space. On some bikes, it's really not a problem, but they've gotten really, more and more crowded on what's in these bikes, and finding space for a piggyback device on a today's Sportster, for example, is very difficult. Okay, the second way to do it, excuse me. Okay, second way to do it is with a replacement ECM. There are several of those nationally. What we see locally here the most of is Zipper's Thundermax. They can all be really good units. They got one big problem, which is that if you care about your warranty, it will detonate it pretty much instantly. Harley takes a very dim view of a brain transplant on their motorcycle. And the other thing is that Harley's EFI module is just shockingly reliable. It really is a good piece. Its downside is that it's not programmable, but we have ways to get around that where you don't have to detonate your warranty. And also, protocols change over time, and so what works today, suddenly 3 years later, your turn signals aren't working right, and it turns out that there's, some change, and now you need a firmware update in your replacement brain box. And for a lot of folks, taking off your Harley module to replace it with that may not be the best choice for cost. Anyway, I don't mean to talk down about those units, because some of them are quite good, and I think you're probably using a Thundermax with this.
We're using a Thundermax on that,
and you're starting from scratch.
Right, and part of what Grease and Gears Garage is, we build custom motorcycles, and so you just have to know that that's a kind of a custom application. When you venture outside of the OEM realm with a customization like that, whether it's performance or aesthetics, you're now hanging yourself out there to have to do a lot of thinking on your own.
Right.
That's
and potential repair.
That's
problems
on
your own.
So.
Okay, and the third way to do it is a reflash device. There are now several of those. Probably the most famous was the Super Tuner, which I mentioned before, which is no longer sold. There is also Vance & Hines has one, and Dynajet has one with their Power Vision. They're good units. What is warranty compliant is Harley-Davidson Street Performance Tuner. So that's what one of those looks like. And it doesn't stay on your bike. This is really just an interface to allow us to talk to your ECM. Your your fuel injection module. So if you've got Harley-Davidson components, this has a map for that, right? And Harley's components are really very good. They have a pretty broad spectrum of performance applications. So, you know, for the most part, I think you're good staying within that realm. However, most people aren't happy with Harley's exhaust because they're not loud enough. They want a sound that's a little bit more robust than what the EPA compliancy allows Harley-Davidson to provide. And so you can stay within Harley-Davidson's performance group on everything, right? But then you want to go outside for exhaust. Not everybody, but a lot of folks, because you want to make a little bit more noise or you want to reduce the heat that catalytic converter puts off. So Harley has, and astonishingly so, this is warranty compliant. Harley has this device, which is the SmartTune Pro. Man, where's my O2 sensors? Where's that box?
Dum, 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 dum. There's boxes here, but I don't know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, if Jessica can find it, I'll show it to you. But the factory uses a narrow band O2 sensor that can only provide so much information, and it just the ECM supposedly will adjust to additional flow, but it is such a narrow piece that it's really insignificant. This, on the other hand, will tune plus or minus 20%. So you can put that header pipe that I showed off before, right? So you have Harley's stage 4 or whatever, Harley's intake, Harley's throttle body, Harley's internal components, everything else, but you choose a different exhaust system that simply outflows the exhaust system. So you add this, and it looks at wideband O2 sensors as the exhaust gases come out. It's taking a look at those things, and it goes, we're a little too lean. Let's add some more fuel. And this works in conjunction with the SmartTune Pro so that you can have a compliant, legal, fully warrantable. There it is. Oh, that's yours, right?
Yeah, you didn't have one.
You know,
well, I got
how it looks.
I know what it looks like.
It looks the same.
Looks
Isn't that remarkable?
Isn't that amazing? They all look the same.
Anti-seize on that.
Yeah.
So that's it's a little bit bulkier looking than the stock 2010 and later O2 sensors, but it goes into the same. Well, actually, we have to modify the exhaust port. Most aftermarket systems come with the ability to use either size. So this one. You want to use the stock O2 sensors in there, you just put a reducer in there, and it probably comes with the reducers. Most aftermarket pipes will allow you to use either one. So this is, and there's been a lot of confusion about this since Harley changed their warranty rules in 2014 to make the EPA happy. And they said, we won't sell the Super Tuner anymore, and B, we're not going to warranty something that's been tuned with a non-EPA compliant tuner, right? So this is an EPA compliant tuner, and this is also EPA compliant because what it does is simply adjust things to this map, right? So it's not leaner than this map wants it to be. Does that make sense? How am I doing so far?
You're doing great. I am really. What is your title at the dealership?
What's my title, Jessica? They call me the general manager.
The general manager.
I'm the director of Harley-Davidson.
I worked at a Harley dealer for 2 months in my lifetime, and it was good when we parted ways because they didn't like me, but but turns out feeling was mutual. No, I just wasn't it didn't work out at the dealership. My brother, on the other hand, whole life, Harley dealerships. So I've met a lot of general managers at Harley dealerships. I have never met a general manager at a Harley dealership that knew a damn thing about motorcycles. So I am just super impressed at your knowledge level.
A little different.
Yeah.
I started out in the service department,
which is where general managers should start. They shouldn't just get hired at the top.
And I don't know about that, but it is unusual, and I will say that I've benefited from, I've run parts department and service department and sold bikes and sold leather jackets, so it does give you an appreciation of the whole thing.
Absolutely. You're doing a great job, though.
So, really important thing to get across and to reinforce what the answer to that gentleman's question is. It's really important that the tuning is done properly for your motorcycle, because you do all the component changes correctly and it's not tuned right, that is bad news, right? If it's too rich, no big deal. Your plugs are going to foul, your gas mileage is going to not be very good, and maybe it's not going to run as well as it should. But if it's running too lean, you can really cause yourself big problems. And if you go to the dealer and say, I got these problems and I've got all Harley Davidson stuff in here, and they go, okay, motor company, we need to warranty this stuff, they're going to say, how's it tuned? And if the answer is it's not, you're done. Okay, what's next? Okay, well, I guess I covered that without using the slide. Sorry about that. So I don't want to rehash this stuff, but I do want to make sure I explained it properly, because there was a lot of confusion, even a lot of confusion within Harley dealerships. When Harley Davidson came out with that rule, you can't use another tuner, there were some folks that were going, okay, well, I guess I just have to detonate my warranty. No, you don't. There were some folks that were saying, well, we'll just put this full Vance & Hines exhaust system on here, and we'll do a stage 1 download with this, and it's okay because this is EPA compliant. No, it's not okay, because that's not an appropriate tune for that collection of components, right? Right now, Harley doesn't, they take a don't ask, don't tell policy on the exhaust, but not on this, and not on the appropriateness of it. Okay, what's the next slide? Okay, so here's a dyno chart. Probably most of you have seen one of these before, but I'm just going to go through it real quick. This white dotted line that you see that starts at a little under 2,500 at 100. Well, first of all, so this represents RPMs, right? So that's 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, and so forth. And this represents pounds-feet of torque or number of horsepower, right? So that white dotted line represents a torque curve, okay? And the black dotted line represents the horsepower number. And again, that horsepower number is a calculation. Torque times the RPM at that spot divided by a constant, 5,252. So what you see on that dotted white line, can everybody see that okay? It's a little funny looking up here.
On these screens, it's really clear, though, I think.
Oh, it's on there, too?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what you see on that dotted line is it's kind of going downhill almost from the beginning, right? So this motor makes a fair amount of torque, from idle to what, 2,500, almost 3,000, and then it starts going downhill. Now, the reason the horsepower number is still going up is because the RPMs are going up. And again, so the RPMs are going up a little faster than the torque is going down. Make sense? And that's why the horsepower number is going up. But when you're riding that motorcycle, it's just not super satisfying, because what you're getting is, but you're holding that throttle open and you're not feeling the arm stretch, Now, let's take a look at that orange line. So that's also a torque curve on a different, more powerful motor. But one of the things that you see, excuse me, is that at 2,500, you're actually making a little bit less power, right? But look at what happens at 4,500. You're making what, 20 pounds of torque more? I mean, it's huge, huge. You go over to 5,000 RPMs and you're, over 25 pounds of torque more, closing in on 30.
Which is one of the things that I noticed riding that Milwaukee 8 when you get on it. I call it passing power. I mean,
Yep.
all of a sudden, you want to get around that big truck and the wind's, I'm from Iowa, so we always have a 45-mile-an-hour wind out there. You crack that thing, it slips through. I mean, it goes, it dumps, and that's very satisfying on
Yep.
that new motor.
Yeah. So what you find when you're riding a motor that has that torque curve is that you get on it and then you feel it really start to come on, and that's why I call it the arm stretch, because it's like, and then whoa, nice, right? So that's the kind of thing that can change your riding style. And that's an important part of the conversation if you're talking to somebody about what you want to do with your motorcycle and what you want to do with your motor. Because your riding style today might be that you always shift at 3,000 RPMs. Okay, consider the fact that if you had a different kind of power delivery, it might be a little more fun to hang in there till 4 before you boot it up one, right? Okay, so just some things to think about. And then, I think a lot of times we sort of take for granted that people look at these things like we do and they know what it means. What it means is that orange line, again, is your torque curve. And you can see how it looks a little umbrella-esque, right? It's a little peaky. It makes its peak power at 5,000 RPMs. That's probably a stage 4, 114. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
A stage 3, instead of the peak being at 5,000, it'd probably be more like 4,000, right? So you'd have a little more low-end torque. You'd give up high-end horsepower, but you'd have a more satisfying low end. Anything, have you been reading this slide, Pat?
I have been. No, you've got it. Well, just the bottom there, you were kind of getting to it. I mean, you were talking about riding style, torque for the street, horsepower for the race.
Right.
This kind of thing. So.
Yeah, so, a lot of times, and I'm sure you experienced this in past shops, people say, well, these guys build race motors, so, I want them to build my motor. I'm not saying that people that build race motors don't know how to build motors. Sure they do. But there's a different goal there, right? And in some race motors, they may, simply expect to rebuild that motor at the end of every season or twice during the season. So those motors are typically set up a little loose because they don't want to have to break them in, and it doesn't make sense to break them in. They're just stressing that motor more. They set them up loose. That's not the way you'd want to set up your street motor. Just the same way with the power delivery. If they're used to making power for a racetrack, they're probably making it at a specific RPM range. You may want something different, and they may not be speaking your language. So just make sure that you're speaking to somebody that's listening to what's important to you. So you notice how the torque curve crosses the horsepower curve, right? And you'll notice that even though those two curves are really different from the stock to the stage 4, they both cross at a constant. And it's because horsepower is just a mathematical calculation, right? So they cross at 5,252 because that's the divisor. There's math, Pat. Okay, umbrella, not Matterhorn. I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? Sorry, thought I heard something. Okay, so the Milwaukee 8. In 2017, Harley released the new motor for its touring platform, and this year it went into the new chassis for the combination of the Softails and Dynas that's been redesigned. This is a really big deal. The last time Harley-Davidson came out with a truly new motor was the Twin Cam in 1999, and prior to that it was the Evo in 1984. So this is not something that they do very often. And it's a big deal. I have a
Well, don't forget the venerable V-Rod.
Well, there was the V-Rod. Thank you very much. And actually that kind of lives on in the street. The street is a
smaller version.
Largely a smaller version of the V-Rod. But it's an awful lot of stuff from the V-Rod turned into the street. So can they see these on the table?
Yes, they can.
Okay. So this is a twin cam. Everybody seeing this all right? Yes? Okay, cool. So this is a twin cam head, and you can see that it has 2 valves, right? They're pretty big. But you can only make these valves so big before they start bumping into each other without turning it into sort of an oval-shaped combustion chamber, which doesn't work well for their architecture, or having eccentrically shaped valves, which doesn't work well for the valves in the valve seats. So that's a twin cam head. That's what the top of it looks like, the valve springs. This is a Milwaukee 8 head, and we still got a good shot of this. Can you see this spark plug in there? Okay, so there's 2 spark plugs in here, one on this side and one on this side. Tip it up. Thank you. How's that? bueno.
It's like it was built to be a display. That's good.
Yeah, stands up there pretty nice. Don't want to break those towers, however.
No.
So the reason it has, well, one of the benefits, I should say, of having 2 spark plugs is when we were talking about how the motor works, right? So it gets to the top of that compression stroke, right? And this is how we'd explain it. It gets to the top of that compression stroke, and the spark plug fires, creates a, explosion, right? And that creates heat, which causes expansion, which pushes that piston down. Okay, but it doesn't actually happen right at the top of the stroke, because if it did, the piston would already be going down when that explosion happened, and you'd be giving up some of the power, right? What you really want is for that explosion to happen right as it's getting ready to drop. But combustion isn't instantaneous. It takes a little bit of time, right? So you light the fuse, if you will, and that flame front spreads. And even though this happens really fast, it's not instantaneous, right? So it grows across the combustion chamber. So what you really want is for that balance of, right when that explosion is at its peak is when you want the piston to be starting to drop, right? But if you light the fuse a little too quickly, then the piston is still trying to come up when that explosion is happening, right? So that's a lot of resistance against that piston. It's also a lot of loss of power. It's also super dangerous to your motor, right? And when you hear some pinging, right, a lot of times, what you're hearing is the motor fighting against itself, right? This detonation where this explosion is occurring while the piston is still coming up, all right? So what if you could reduce the time that combustion took to occur? And 2 spark plugs can do that, and that was actually a sort of an old hot rodder trick for both shovel heads and for Evos. You don't see them a lot, but actually there was I forget whether it was an FXR or a shovel head out on the floor in the bike show where it had 2 plug heads.
We used to do it to Ironhead Sporties all the time. That was when Evo Sporties came out. We were like, if you dual plug the heads,
make them go faster.
Yeah, we got to keep up.
And you still got to fix the intake leaks.
Exactly.
So that's why it has 2. Well, that's one of the reasons that it has 2 spark plugs. So you can make that combustion happen more rapidly. And what that means is that you can use less, we call it advanced timing, right? So the number of degrees prior to that piston being at top dead center when the spark plug fires. So if, let's say with 1 spark plug, you need to do it 40 degrees before top dead center. That 40 degrees, this is 360 degrees. It refers to the rotation of the flywheel assembly. So if you got to do it 40 degrees before top dead center, you're doing it about here. Well, if you have 2 spark plugs, that can turn into 20 degrees before. And that makes combustion a little more efficient. It makes combustion happen more rapidly, which means you got a little bit less parasitic loss, right? That power working against itself. And probably that you have more emissions. And then it also, there may have been a little bit of a practical reason, because this would be the best place if you had 1 spark plug, and that's where they have a compression release. You could have put that on the side, but we'll see what they do in the future. Maybe that's a spot for direct injection.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Okay, so that's a little bit about the Milwaukee 8 head. And just, I don't know that we covered this. The reason they call it the Milwaukee 8 is that there's 4 valves per head, and there's 2 cylinders. So it's
and
8
4
valves.
times 2 is 8. He can do the big math, and I'll handle the small
You
math.
said you didn't like math.
Boom.
Okay, another interesting thing about the Milwaukee 8, in 2009, in Harley's touring chassis, they redesigned the rubber mount system, which had been, unchanged since 1980, for the most part. There was a minor little change, but insignificant. In 2009, they really redesigned those rubber mounts and how the motor is held into the chassis. The reason for the rubber mounts is so that the motor vibrates, right, but it doesn't send that vibration onto you, the rider. And they wanted to control that vibration a little bit more, but at the same time still keep a nice smooth ride. Well, enter the Milwaukee 8s. As long as they were redesigning the motor, they redesigned it with a counterbalancer. And the counterbalancer removes about 75% of the vibration by itself. So you got a motor that, just all by itself is producing less vibration. And then it's contained in the chassis with the same rubber mount system they used before. And the result is, you feel some pulsing. It's not as dead smooth as the Twin Cam B Softails, but it's pretty darn smooth. You feel a little bit of a pulse. It's funny because I've been riding one recently, and then I got back on an older Twin Cam and thought, this thing kind of shakes a lot, doesn't it? It's funny how you get used to this stuff so quickly.
I think it's been interesting, too. It used to be, we rode Harleys because of that. It was.
I still like it.
We had all kinds of phrases for it. It jiggled things in just the right way. But it is interesting how it has progressed to try to become smoother and smoother and smoother.
Actually, Pat, if I can interject something real quick.
God.
When we went on the press ride when they first released the Milwaukee 8s, they told us that originally they had worked that motor so that it was even smoother than how it's configured now, and they introduced it to a focus group, and there was so little of the familiar vibration that inherently came from the motor, they backed the dampening off so that some of that vibration came back because customers were kind of uncomfortable with the fact that it didn't have enough of that original feel, so it can even be smoother.
Hard to make everybody happy, isn't it?
Engineering a fault.
I wish I brought the counterbalancer. I actually have the quick plug for the shop at All American Harley Davidson. We have a full Milwaukee 8 motor disassembled. So we'll do, if you check our website and our calendar of events, sometime soon we will do a Milwaukee 8 seminar, right, Jess? Hey, Steve, what's up, buddy? Okay, so. Yeah, the counterbalancer, I should have brought that. Oh, well. But it's driven totally differently than the 88B motors, which had twin counterbalancers driven off by a chain. This is a really compact unit, and it spins right in between the flywheel assembly, gear-driven, and all they would have to do to accomplish what he was talking about was make that weight a little bit bigger for reduced vibration, make that weight a little bit smaller for increased vibration. On the new Softail Dyna chassis, they actually use a second counterbalancer that runs off the same gear. It just runs, one is running in front, but it just doesn't take up a lot of space. The other one's running right behind the flywheel assembly, so that's kind of cool. And obviously the weights are different, but I don't know what they are. What's next on this? Hey, go back one. So another thing, let's talk about this for a second. So the Milwaukee 8, in 2014, Harley Davidson they modified their twin cam motor so that it was twin cooled. How's that work?
That's perfect.
Pro, right? So the twin cooled motor, they referred to it as twin cooled because it was cooled by air and oil, like all air cooled motors. And then it had a small reservoir of a coolant that cycled through a small pump and went into the head. It went around the exhaust valve seat, back out, and the exhaust valve seat is by far the hottest part of the motor because that's where the exhaust gases are coming out. The intake valve gets cooled off by incoming air and fuel, so it runs relatively cool, but the exhaust valve is, hard metal, not aluminum, right? So it retains, a type of steel, so it retains a lot more heat. The valve seat, which is the piece that the valve lands on, because if you didn't have a hard metal valve seat, it would just slam into this aluminum and tear it up pretty quick. So those things retain a lot of heat, and of course this, explosion is happening fairly rapidly. So you got a lot of heat generated in there, a lot of it retained around the exhaust valve here, and they wanted to cool that off. So the twin cool accomplished that pretty well. With the Milwaukee 8, they do it with oil, right? So they have a totally different oil pump that splits into two circuits. It's got one circuit is 1 gallon per minute, and that's used to lubricate the motor, and the other circuit is 4 gallons per minute, right? 4 times as much, and that circulates oil through the head. And what it does is it goes into, am I pointing at the right
Yes,
spot?
you are. Yeah.
It goes into one of these guys and runs right in between the 2 exhaust valve seats, because that's the hottest spot, and then it runs back out, and that oil gets dropped into the back of the oil pan. And the oil pan is made of aluminum, so it sheds heat, and it's also got this labyrinth through it, right? So the oil drops in, and then it has to go around this labyrinth. And what that means is that the oil that's the hottest going in is the last stuff to get pulled out, right? So you're pulling the cooler oil out. And sometimes you would see in oil tanks, even though you had 3 or 4 quarts of oil in there, what was circulating was really more like 1.5 quarts, and then you had this cooler pool of oil back here. So when they designed these oil pans in, I don't know, 93 or something, they've done it different ways over the years, but that was one of the key things was, let's make sure that oil stays in there long enough to cool off, and so it follows this path. And that's even more important when you're using that oil to really, really cool the head. So the Milwaukee 8, they managed to produce more power, produce fewer vibrations, run substantially cooler to the rider, right? The motor still gets hot, but it's got a more effective way of cooling things off. And it gets better gas mileage. It's like the holy grail.
It is. It's a
all right,
remarkable piece of engineering.
So as I think we mentioned before, when Harley released the Milwaukee 8, and you know, when the Evo came out, I wasn't there when it came out, but I was there, you know, a few years later. And, you know, as Pat was referencing earlier, you had all these aftermarket companies coming in and saying, you know, use this and use this and use this. And Harley was pretty late to the game in producing components to make those motors go faster. But they are really the right people to be doing it, because they have access to testing that is remarkable that other people don't have access to, right? I mean, they've got these testing machines where they can fire up a motor. They got hundreds of motors. They can fire them up with different things, take them apart after, you know, they go home for the weekend and let things run at 6,000 RPMs, come back in on Tuesday and, you know, measure everything with micrometers and see how much wear there is. And you just don't have the ability to do that at a sum that you could possibly afford if you're an aftermarket company. One of the reasons they have a benefit is that the Screaming Eagle guys have access to the OE tests. So they just go, here, put my stuff in it and run the same tests you run on the OE stuff, which is just a huge advantage.
Right.
So it was important to the Screaming Eagle division that when they released this motor, they had thought through the Screaming Eagle side of things also, and that they released it with some kits, which they did. So they had the Stage 1 that we talked about a little bit earlier, the Stage 1 kits, which is a variety of different air cleaners, and the Street Performance Tuner. And they had 2 different choices in camshafts for a Stage 2, a third choice in camshafts with their Stage 3 with increased displacement, and yet another 4th choice in cams for their Stage 4.
Now, one of the things that I have heard, you can either confirm or deny, sir, is that part of what also with the Milwaukee 8 with the computer is that whether you've got a Stage 1 or a Stage 4, it will allow you to get to a certain speed, like 110, 112 miles an hour. You can get there quicker, but you can't exceed a certain speed limit. Is this myth or is this fact?
You know, I think that may actually be fact with the tuner, but there's got to be a way to defeat that.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I don't know how to defeat it in the stock configuration, but we have heard that, you know, the only other way that anybody's figured out how to do it, because I got an argument with a guy on a forum about it, and I said, you can't go any faster. Trust me, you can't go any faster. And he said, well, yeah, you can, but he did a brain transplant and,
right,
you know, put a flow charger on it. I mean, that was...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure the answer to that. I will say that just from a... I'm going to find out the answer and let you know, because I know the exact guy to talk to.
Well, you know, and I think,
but they build these kits for race also, So it may be that they say, all right, you got to do that a different way with tuning, but once you do that, we can see it. And
well, let's talk about it, because that is one of the things that Chris and Heather with Cycle Source have asked me to kind of investigate and write an article for the magazine. And Harley Davidson has been 10 minutes has been surprisingly quiet on this issue with me when I asked that question. And so,
who do you talk to?
Well, I've just been trying to talk to dealers. You know, I mean, I haven't.
I'll put you in touch with the right guy.
But yeah, so maybe we could work on an article about that, because I don't know why anybody. Honestly, I mean, I like to go fast and do burnouts, and I got excited yesterday when Yelvington was up here, because they've got a reverse thing you can put on your bike.
The one with air compression.
Yeah, and you can do a burnout in reverse, which they don't recommend, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think it's cool. But anyway, I don't know why. So I like to go fast, but I don't know why you'd ever want to go over 114 miles an hour. There is not a road in this country where you can do that.
Well, I can answer that question. You would want to do that when you're traveling across country and you're on 50.
Yeah.
And I mean, that stretch where the next thing that you see is a hill.
Yeah.
It's about 5 miles away and there's no cars, and you go,
well, exactly. I mean,
honey, I'll be back in a minute.
If you're in West Texas, I mean, I get it. I mean, you're just going to hammer down and get to Phoenix.
And if it cut me off at 114, I can tell you I would have been kind of chapped.
Yeah, and so I come up with that because my brother, who's at Gainesville Harley Davidson, his finance manager, actually has Milwaukee 8, and he was a little chapped. I don't know where he was in Florida, but I think he was on the interstate, and he couldn't go any faster, and then he comes back and he says, hey, something's wrong with the bike.
I mean, getting a bike up to 100 around here is a very dicey maneuver.
Oh, I would assume so, yeah. But anyway, yeah, let's talk more about that then later, because
I'll definitely give you answers to that.
Yeah.
Hey, we touched earlier on a displacement increase, and I realized that there's a couple things that I missed. One was a piece on mufflers, and one was a piece on the displacement. So the way that the displacement is increased, can we see that?
Yep.
Everybody see that? So this is the cylinder that the piston travels in, and it's made of aluminum. This little piece right here, if you can see the color difference, that's cast iron. Okay, so that's the hard part that needs to live a nice long life with the piston going up and down it really fast. So if you change how wide this is, right, you bore this out, you get a larger bore. And that is one of the two ways you can increase displacement. In Harley's Milwaukee 8, their 107 to 114 kit, that is the difference, right? So it's a larger bore in the cylinder and then a larger piston to accommodate that larger bore. The other way to increase displacement is the length of the stroke. So that's a little more complex because you have to split the cases and change the bottom end. So it entails more money. But, back in the old days of Evo, that was the old line, right? If you want more inches, you got to stroke it.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't say that.
I didn't say it either. I was just quoting the T-shirt.
You had to have a stroker motor back in the day.
Right.
You didn't have any.
So, and the stroke is changed. Let's not get into that. If anybody wants to know, I'll tell you. But it's the location, it's the offset of the crank pin to the center of the flywheel assembly, and that makes the piston travel a longer distance. Okay, and then exhaust. So we talked about the header pipes, and we're about done here, right?
Yeah, we got about.
So there's 3 mufflers here. I have no idea if we can see this. I'm gonna let you try to hold them up. You hold one. That should be a louvered baffle. Can we see the louvers in that thing? Yes, no?
Can you see the louvers?
Mark, can you see the louvered baffle?
Yeah, they can see it.
Okay, cool.
These guys are really good. Egg's good with that camera.
So this is a perforated baffle. Can you see that? All right. So they're just 2 different kinds of baffles. And in general, you'll get a better performance with a perforated baffle than a louvered baffle. But there's a lot of different ways to slice that. Can we see that? You'll notice that you can't see through that one. That's how you get your worst performance.
Hello. You can't see through that one.
Okay. I think that's it.
All right.
We
got any questions? Man, I tell you, this is one of the. Oh, here we go. Is Heather's? Oh, here's Heather. She's running. She's running the race. She will not stop.
So when you showed the head of the Milwaukee 8,
Yeah.
In the center was the compression release.
Yes.
Is that on all Milwaukee 8 engines?
Yes.
Or is that just a performance thing?
Nope, that's on all Milwaukee 8. So, one of the problems with these big inch, high compression motors is the starter, right? So that starter with no momentum, the starter is trying to turn those heavy flywheels, and especially if the first thing that happens is the piston is coming up on the compression stroke, and that just depends on where the motor stops, but a lot of times it stops there because it's that additional pressure coming up on the compression stroke that makes the motor go, okay, I'm going to stop here, right? So the first thing that happens is it's going up and pressing against all that pressure, and I'm sure lots of folks who have ridden long enough have experienced that time when their battery is kind of coming to the end of its life, and they go out and it goes click, 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 and the new ones go which is kind of funny.
Well,
it's like the buzzer on the
and early on with the Evo stuff, they wouldn't set of compression releases. They just started doing high torque starters. They did, and that was the wrong direction to go.
Well, so what it does is just open a little valve, and there's been a couple of different ways they've done the protocol, but essentially when you got the power to the ignition switch on and then the kill switch in the run position, it applies power to that, which opens this valve, and then when it feels the pressure from compression, it pops it closed, but you get a little bit of the cylinder pressure inside bleeds off that allows that starter to get going, build a little momentum, and then things fire up. And that's going to lead to a longer life on the starter. Also, sometimes those starters kick back, and the gear that's engaging on the ring gear around your clutch basket, that gets torn up, which, can create shrapnel.
You've got another question, right?
I was just going to say that on the Milwaukee 8, it'll make you feel like you have a bad battery because you hit the starter and it'll go roar and not kick over. You have to let off on the starter and then hit it again and it'll start. Mine does that to me all the time.
If you live close, let's take a look at it. If you don't, ask your dealer to take a look at it. It shouldn't be doing that.
It does it.
I don't know if
it shouldn't do that.
Old compression releases, you could get one that would stick, and I'm sure these are miles ahead of what I've ever used. But you could get one that would stick, and then it would do that. I know that it wouldn't release pressure.
You mean stick where it was closed?
Like, yeah, it was closed, it wouldn't open.
I've seen them more where they stick open and
stick
close, right?
Yeah. So.
But it shouldn't be doing that. I have a stage 4, and it turns over well. So let's look and see if you got full power going to the starter, or if there isn't some resistance someplace provided by a bad connection.
Right on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Lyndon Abell, and thank you so much. Great information. I'm excited the fact that we Facebook Live this stuff for just this reason. You can go back and look on Cycle Source, motorcycleshows.com, jmpcycles.com. Go to Grease and Gears Garage, our YouTube channel, and you're going to be able to go and sit down and stop this and run it back and be able to. This is great information. I mean, this will impress all your friends when you sit down and you do bench racing, if any of you still do that, just talking about how to make things go fast. Thank you so much, man.
Right,
Great
thanks,
information.
Pat. Appreciate it.
Super job, man.